So we're going to now spend a few minutes considering how we decide if someone is obese or not. How do we measure that? So many of you will be familiar with BMI categorization, and this has been around decades. It's very well recognized, very widely used, and certainly used by the World Health Organization. So it's a classification of weight in relation to height in meters squared, so weight in kilograms. And we have the healthy weight, overweight, obesity 1, 2, and 3. And of course, there would be underweight as well, not relevant to this session on weight management. So it takes into account this kind of natural variation of shape and bones and all sorts of things like that, and gives, for a population, gives an understanding of where people fit into categorizing them. But we do have to really be very mindful of when it doesn't work. And it doesn't work when people have a particularly high proportion of lean body mass. So athletes, rugby players, heavyweight boxers. You're not going to look at most rugby players and say, oh gosh, you're looking as if you've got too much fat on board, because actually most often they're really muscular. And the amount of fat that they have is very small. So they are a different body composition to the average person in the general public. Of course, when women are pregnant, that is going to make a difference to their shape and size, the amount of body fluid they've got on board, and of course the size of the baby. So that's not going to make any sense. But also with older people, we need to be really careful, because older people tend to have less lean body mass. So proportionally, they are likely to have more fat. But does that matter? Is BMI therefore relevant to them? How accurate and how useful is it? And that, I think it should be questioned above the age of about 65. But if you look around the older people that you come across, some 65-year-olds will be quite frail. Some 85-year-olds will be running marathons. So it's really important that we look at the individual while we're considering this. Is this a person who's perhaps quite lean and quite muscular, or is it someone who's looking as if they're quite frail, and that lean body mass may be proportionally less? So we might want to consider other things with older people, such as weight history, weight loss. So we have something that's quite useful. We need to be mindful of using it in children. It's very different how we use it in children. But it is a useful measure. But what about other limitations? So one of the things that we have to consider is different ethnic origins. Now this is highly complex, but we do know, for example, that people of South Asian origin tend to have more health problems at a lower weight. So you can see in the middle column on this table, some of the bits highlighted in red, those are different to the normal BMI ranges. So if I had a BMI of 23, that would put me bang in the middle of the healthy weight range. But for someone of a South Asian background, there will be that difference. Actually, 23 is high and would put them at some increased risk. So you look along here and you can see there are differences in waist circumference, there are differences in BMI through different ethnic minority groups. And of course, there are so many people who have mixed heritage that gets even more complicated. So again, we've got to be mindful of the person we've got in front of us. How relevant is this? Is there any reason why BMI might not be as useful as it is for other people? So just be really mindful of that. So what about waist circumference? This is really important because shape is really important. So you can have people with the same BMI and them being extremely different shapes. And one of the things that we know is that having a larger waist circumference is less healthy than having larger hips and thighs. So it's that difference between someone who's an apple shape, so round, got most of their body fat around their middle, but could have quite slim legs and arms, or someone who is a pear shape, the top of their body is smaller than the bottom half, relatively waists are smaller, and those people are at less risk. So we've got to be mindful, actually, what shape is this person? Do we need to think about not just looking at BMI, but looking at their shape? And ideally, you would do that. You just have to think of some of the challenges of measuring waist circumference, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So BMI is practical, but in people who have a BMI of less than 35 kilograms per metre squared, can we use waist circumference as well? It's not relevant to use it over a BMI of 35 because someone who's got a BMI of 35 has got more fat in their body than is healthy and needs to ideally lose weight if they can. So it's for those people who might be not as overweight, but still might not be the ideal shape that we might need to consider. So we also need to think about, well, is BMI on its own enough? Is waist circumference enough? What do we need to actually think about? Because we all, of course, have different genetic backgrounds and different risk because of that. So we also need to be aware that people of a healthy weight might need advice on a healthy diet, because being a healthy weight does not necessarily mean a healthy diet. So we've got those considerations to make. And this table, I think, is quite useful because it says even if someone is slightly overweight, but they have a low waist circumference, they might have comorbidities. So we need to be thinking about those comorbidities as well. They might have high blood pressure, they might have high cholesterol or other types of hyperlipidemia, they might have type 2 diabetes. So we can look at the risk. Do they have comorbidities? What's their waist in relation to their level of overweight? And what, therefore, do we need to do and offer them for treatment? So if they're low waist circumference in the overweight category, we want to help people to stay there or to lose weight. We don't want them to become obese. So there's still a role there for general healthy eating advice, advice on physical activity and maintaining a healthy weight, because we don't want those people to go on to develop other comorbidities. And as the risk goes up, more interventions might be considered. So we might be looking at medication, we might be looking at surgery, bariatric surgery, and you'll learn a lot more about that in later stages of the course. So we've got all of these things to think about. So looking much more holistically than just BMI. And this Edmonton staging criteria is an alternative way of looking at weight management and what we might need to consider if people are trying to manage their weight. So we've got a definition of different stages, and this includes comorbidities again. So, stage 0, no apparent obesity-related risk factors. So the blood pressure, the lipids, fasting glucose, all completely normal. Stage 1, we've got some subclinical risk factors. So it might be that the blood pressure is borderline, the fasting glucose, or this actually has changed recently in that the diabetes management has changed, and it's pretty much all done on HbA1c, and we'll be covering that in the subsequent weeks, talking about type 2 diabetes. So the way that type 2 diabetes is categorized now has slightly changed. But you may have someone who is pre-diabetic. You might need to think about that. But as you go through the different stages, you get to stage 4, and you've got people who've got a number of comorbidities or disabilities related to obesity. So they might have end-stage illnesses. So the diabetes might have gone to renal failure, for example. They may have great difficulty in doing activities of daily living, severe impairment of their well-being, because psychological impacts of obesity are quite significant. So the management is looking much more holistically at the person, the physical, the mental aspects of the impact of obesity, all of those different things. The stages get worse, the level of intervention increases, management increases. So it's just a different way of looking at it. But I think one of the key things is look at that person holistically. What's going on for them? What are their, don't just look at weight, don't just look at BMI, look at the person, at all the other medical aspects, how it's impacting on their mental health, and consider it much more holistically than just BMI or weight. So let's just think about some of the challenges with measuring obesity, because it sounds quite simple, how heavy are you, how tall are you, and we'll work out BMI. But we really need to think about when that might get challenging. I don't know how many of you have bathroom scales, but bathroom scales are notoriously inaccurate. So are the scales that we're using accurate? Even in primary care and hospitals, have those scales been maintained? Have they been calibrated recently? Have they been checked? They should be checked every 6 months, but sometimes things like that haven't happened. So are the scales that person is being measured on accurate? Is the height measure set up properly? Are we measuring that person with shoes, without shoes? Are we remembering to get them to take their coat off? How many layers of clothing have they got? Have they got tons of change and keys and things in their pockets that are going to affect the weight? Have they just had a meal, or just had a pint of something, that's going to affect their weight? So ideally, weight would be measured at a consistent time of day, and with accurate scales, and with a height measure that is set up accurately. Self-reported height is notoriously inaccurate. Self-reported weight also. So ideally we need accurately well-maintained scales, and we need scales that will go up to the levels of weight that the patients we are seeing are likely to be. Believe me, there is huge embarrassment of having scales that don't go high enough for the patient in front of you. Been there. Not a pleasant situation when you have to say to someone, I can't weigh you because you're too heavy. So we need to think of those things, and sometimes it can be extremely difficult. You may have a patient who can't stand up very well, who can't weight bear. You might need sitting scales, which you can often get in hospital, but not often in a community setting. So there's all of these things to consider. People may be very self-conscious about their weight. You think about that. If someone says, "Oh, just jump on the scales and get weighed," how do people feel about that? Weight can be something that people are very sensitive about. They could also be shocked if they haven't weighed themselves recently. So it needs to be handled very, very carefully and with consent. Would you be all right to stand on the scales for me? Would it be all right if we checked your weight? So really be mindful of that. And also, how comfortable are you with measuring people? How comfortable are you with measuring waist? You might need to lift some clothing. You also might need extra long tape measures. And how do you get round people? You might get them to hold the tape measure in one place and turn round, or you walk round them, because you can't just, like you would a smaller person, you can't just put a tape measure round and hold it. So there's a lot of practical things that you need to consider that actually sometimes can make measuring weight accurately really, really challenging. So have some thoughts about that.